as many of you know, last year, Rick Kennedy had a paper published in the Christian Scholars Review that got awarded the Paper of the Year. Is that the official title?
Yeah, it's got a name to it.
Yeah, but some official paper of the year, and which is quite an honor. And so last year indicated that we want to try to find an appropriate venue for Rick to be able to kind of present that information here. And as we looked at the content of that paper and some of the arguments that Rick is making in that paper, we thought it'd be a good discussion for GE. In general, it doesn't simply rely on or reside within GE, but we thought that would be a good venue for it to dialogue. And so what we're going to have is Rick is going to come up and spend 15-20 minutes kind of going over just a summary of how he wants to kind of portray a summary of that work. And each of the panelists here have read the work, and we've got some questions related to that we will dialogue about. And I will kind of moderate that panel along the way with Rick as a participant with the other three panelists. And then we'll also open up for questions for you all as well. And hopefully this will be a nice, rich dialogue that we will all walk away thinking, I'm glad I came to that. And I think I know something I might try differently in the future. So without further ado, let me go ahead and ask Rick to begin.
Yeah, what we want to do is hopefully spark some ideas, and then we can talk some things through and see how this might be applicable. It's a weird bee thing, you know, and it's a deep history to it, as you can see from the Massachusetts Historical Society seal here. And but I just thought that it's a tool to start discussion, because obviously every class, every different person, every different situation would require something else. So it get us going. So in the first sentence of my article, I quote Alistair McIntyre. Now he's a big guy. He's a big boy. And Alistair McIntyre affirms that humility, obedience, conformity, and faith in authority are essential practices of reading oneself into the scriptures and thinking oneself into a rational tradition. This quote guides the whole of my article, especially the notion that there are essential practices that should be taught in general education in the curriculum of universities. In our romantically scientific age, and that's we might talk about that, I think we live in a very romantic scientific age. Our educational systems have honored humility as a virtue, as a mindset, as an attitude, even as a perspective or a lens to see through, but has removed the practical methods of humility, obedience, conformity, and faith from the curriculum. And they are, and truly should be, essential aspects of our liberal arts curriculum. And so what I guess I'm proposing is a radical transformation of all universities in the world today. But, whatever. We can start here, right? So westward the course of empire takes its sway. There it is right out the window. Okay, so first of all, the most famous image of this probably for all of us is C.S. Lewis's Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. In Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if you remember, there's the scene where the kids come in to talk to the professor, the two older kids, because Lucy's gone and seen Narnia. Edmund went out and saw Narnia too, but they both get back, and Edmund says he didn't see it. Lucy says she did. And they go to the professor, and the professor, leads them in wisdom. He says, but he has this great line. He says, "Logic! Logic! Why don't they teach logic in the schools anymore?" And this is the issue. This is exactly the issue, is that it's a social problem. It's not an imperial problem. It's not intuition, whether Narnia exists. It's whether do you believe someone or not. It's a social issue. Do I trust the kids? And then he leads them through do you believe Lucy more or the other one? And then he says, I think the following is, he says, for the moment then, unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that Lucy is telling the truth. Okay. Now that is a technical aspect taught in logic and through the curriculums of up through C.S. Lewis's childhood. But he looks around Oxford of 1950 when he's writing this and saying, nobody's teaching it anymore. And it's true. I did a study of textbooks and stuff, and yeah, it just disappears from textbooks. It's amazing. So what I want to do is look at this problem. I mean, the most famous issue, the most famous depiction of the issue, like a thought problem type of thing for get students thinking as a tool, as a craft, was John Locke in his essay concerning human education proposed is a Dutch ambassador goes to the king of Siam. Okay, this is down on the equator, right? So the Dutch ambassador goes to the king of Siam and starts to tell the king of Siam about ice, okay? That elephants can walk on cold water. And then the obvious proposition is to the students, should the king of Siam believe the Dutch ambassador that elephants can walk on cold water? And so it's a thought problem. It's a technical, logical issue. What are the tools of trust? You know, do you trust an ambassador? Well, if you remember your 17th century stuff, there was you're a historian and you're laughing. You do remember it. But the thing is remember there's Sir Henry Wotton was this famous famous ambassador for Britain, and he had said the job of an ambassador is to lie for your country, right? So the idea of an ambassador being a truth teller is like questionable. I mean, there's so many layers. This is supposed to be a fun thought question that Locke proposes. Now, being of Wesleyan tradition here, John Wesley, of course, used this. And John Wesley wrote a logic textbook. He wrote an Aristotelian logic textbook, which talks about faith, craft, and humble think. And all the things we're talking about here, John Wesley taught. Okay? This is the situation. You have those kind of things in a very vibrant curriculum talking about reasonableness, especially social knowledge. How do we deal with social knowledge? And then in the 20th century, it disappears. Goes away. Why? Hundreds of millions of reasons, I suppose, but mainly I consider we live in this very romantic scientific age of hero scientists, critical thinkers, where the individual has a big S on their chest. And we've forgotten how to... No, we really don't think that way, okay? So what we have to do is get things back into the curriculum so that we can start thinking that way. So Alistair McIntyre's opening quote, C.S. Lewis, all of this is how do we think ourselves into a tradition? Basically, how do we think ourselves into belief? And Aristotle's got a lot of things here, and we can talk about that. Much of the article has different things. I'll show some things up here. But first and foremost, when I came to Point Loma College back then, Point Loma Nazarene, PLNC, my first faculty meeting, what do they call it? Faculty orientation, was a big discussion of how what we do here at PLNC was teach a student to analyze their faith. And by analyzing, it was to dissect their faith. And then we help them over the course of our 4 years to put that faith back together. Well, that's romantic scientific study. That is absolutely against the tradition of what we're talking about. The tradition is first thing you do is you teach students why they should affirm what they believe, why they affirm the traditions they come from, why the traditions are reasonable, and give them solid foundations of thinking about that. Then, subsequent to this primary education in traditional social thought, you then teach them how to start to be more of an analytical thinker. Now, as Rob knows, I'm sure, Rob, that's the tradition of philosophy, okay? By the classical standards, and I talk about this in the article, is that you had a type of teaching, which was all of this faith, craft, and humble think, and then when a person reached a certain maturity, then you taught them to be a philosopher. And so analysis and synthesis is a secondary skill. It's not a skill you teach right out of the gate with a kid, nor a freshman, nor, especially in general education. You don't want to teach them to dissect first. You want to teach them to affirm first. Then at some point, dissect and work all this sort of stuff out. We historians, we like the image for, at least my image for myself, is a guy in a rowboat, right? I look backwards while I row forwards. And that's somewhat like the tradition we're talking about here. So you got to find that educational tradition. We've got to revive an educational tradition and do it better. PLNU mission statement says we exist to provide a higher education in a vital Christian community where minds are engaged and challenged, character is modeled and formed, and service becomes an expression of faith. Being of Wesleyan heritage, we aspire to be a learning community where grace is foundational, truth is pursued, holiness is a way of life. It's a wonderful statement. But there's two traditions in there. One is Christianity and the other is Wesleyanism. And these are traditions which, by signing my contract to be here, I want to affirm both of them. But how do we do that? How do we do that in the curriculum? And we don't do that by teaching people to dissect them first, And that's what I'd like to talk about here for a second is the four things that, the four stages, the four steps. What is actually the craft of thinking humbly is that first off is what we would call, if you want to get fancy, it's called an epistemological sort of thing, but we don't need to do that at all. It's basically, I called it faithcraft because faith is a word that Aristotle uses constantly. It's the basic foundation of social thinking, and fundamentally it's a recognition. It's a recognition that most of the information we have and work with and are teaching is through books, it's through people, all that sort of stuff. If you're teaching in a laboratory science class, what are your kids learning? They're learning from books about experiments that other people did, and then maybe they'll get a chance to do a practice experiment for themselves. But most of what you learn in a laboratory science is faith. Faith that someone else, somewhere else did this. I remember when I was in biology as a Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and big class, big huge class, reading about a prehistoric fish that was caught off of Madagascar. The only reason I know about Madagascar is because of faith. I've never been there. I have no idea if it's a thing that might be a socially, there might be a conspiracy to make us in America think that Madagascar exists or something. But I only know about, because I trust. I mean, and then that they caught this fish, okay. But I haven't seen the fish. I haven't seen Madagascar. So that's all faith. And so what you need to do is start with a recognition. Start with a recognition. Let's all talk about how much in this class is a matter of tradition, our disciplinary traditions, our religious traditions, all that sort of stuff, and how much of it entails us having to trust each other, all that sort of stuff. Augustine used to make before DNA, the thing was, how do you know who your mother is? Well, you trust your mother. You really don't know she's your mother. You got to trust your mother, So that kind of thing. So that's the recognition there. Second is that once you've got this social world sort of laid out and we recognize it, then what you have to do is start to make these practices. Well, we want to gather as much information as possible. And this is where this libraries and this bee image really starts to play in the classical world. Is the bees go out and they gather pollen and bring them back. And the other one is the flower imagery. You go into the fields and pluck the flowers and create a flower arrangement. And this is, so a library is you are a head flower arranger, And it's this, it should be, it's a great thing. And you are like, it's this beautiful imagery of gathering. And gathering and gathering and gathering. And then especially with this gathering, is this idea of a swarm think, an idea of that when consensus comes together, when you've gathered all this stuff together and see consensus, then consensus probably has truth in it. This is one of Aristotle's great optimisms. He believed that people think better when they think in groups. Okay? Has a wonderful image in the Politics where he actually says dinner parties are better when they're potlucks. Rather than one person cooking, it's actually a better dinner party when everybody brings something. You gotta love Aristotle. I love Aristotle. I think Aristotle would like me. All right, but the thing is that I hope he would. Gosh, I hope he would. But the thing is this idea we think better in swarms of bees, and so there's this swarm think, and it comes down to us mostly in our political traditions, democracy. This idea that we vote with, and if a majority choose something, well, even if I'm in the minority, I will submit to the majority. See, it's a lot about submission. It's a lot about, even though you may think something different personally, you submit to majority positions. Okay? Now, that's the third thing. And then, so faithcraft, and then humble think is all sort of this coming together. And then there's the fifth. This is the spiritual one. And it's also in the classical. It's also in the public. It's the idea that, like when a jury makes a decision, 12 people, you have a social decision. Witnesses bring in information. The prosecutor, defender, twists the information two different directions. A judge sets the rules of evidence. And then 12 people gather to make a final decision. So it's a social decision about justice. And then when those 12 have decided, that most likely is justice. And it gets written down. And so you have these traditions of judicial decisions over years by juries, and so therefore there's a great faith that is justice. Okay? And so there's a power. There's the bees have gotten the pollen, put it in a honeycomb, and magic happens. Justice comes out. So we may disagree with the OJ decision, but overall we have a belief in that the justice system works and produces a type of progress. The same is true in politics. The same is true all sorts of places. I give examples in the article. But it is especially true in Christianity. It's especially true in this Wesleyan heritage. It's especially true in our Christian orthodoxy, is the fundamental belief that, especially, and I give the example of how we get the canon of the Bible in there, is the belief that when lots of people over a long amount of time work together to come to a consensual agreement, that agreement has authority. And our job is to submit. And only break from the submission if, like, you're in some sort of extremely powerful, knowledge base. I mean, otherwise you submit. The default position is submit. And this is... in American history, and I quote this in the article, it's that tradition of you can fool some of the people all the time, all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. A tremendously optimistic statement, which has a lot of fudge factor. And that's how this tradition stuff works. That's how humble think and faithcraft have been taught throughout history. And it was especially foundational. Before you become a philosopher, you first learn humble think. You first learn this faithcraft. And then philosophy is a sort of extra thing. Just to close off, most of us in the room, we have PhDs in philosophy. And that's what PhD means, right? Doctor of philosophy. That's romantic scientism. That's this notion that somehow we're all going to be philosophers. Well, I'm not a philosopher. I really teach more faithcraft, humble think. I'm a historian. I row a boat. I look backwards. This ideal that gets held above us is this idea of the PhD, of philosophy. We're all philosophers. No, we're actually not supposed to be. Many of us, not the whole curriculum, but many of us in the curriculum should be teaching things which are proto-philosophy. Okay. And I guess I'll leave it with that, all right?
Thanks, Rick. We have a few questions that we've prepared, and the audience or the panel has kind of started, but this doesn't necessarily have to guide our whole time together. But so the first question, and this is for any panel member, and then Rick, feel free to respond if you would like in that. But the first one, Rick's paper really is talking about teaching humility and faithcraft, or humble think, as he puts it in our GE coursework. In what ways can you, panel members, see this happening in your classroom? How can this intertwine with your pedagogy in your classroom, and in what ways would that, or how would one look at that and say, yeah, that's what they're doing?
Sense of the 3 questions I prepared on this one. I'll go first. I'll go last on the other one. Okay, everybody. I found myself wanting to introduce Rick to a philosopher because, and the reason I say that, I think we do that. I think this is the very sort of process that you outline in the 4 elements of humble think. This is what we do in our classes. And so I'll just run through sort of quickly. There's this sort of collective lens that society gives us that determines very much the lens we bring to the question, whatever that is. And so part of the task is to figure out where that lens is coming from and how it's impacting, our judgment. So it just so happens I'm teaching theory of knowledge right now. So we're looking at the sources of belief, and we're looking at testimony, where if you take testimony in a fairly broadly construed sort of fashion, much of our beliefs are sourced out of testimony, the testimony of others. And so it already puts us at, in a long tradition, right, of professors and parents and pastors, and that have already come before we start asking the question of belief, and produced for us many of the beliefs that we carry around in our noggin. And so we're already in a position of faith, right, as we come to the question of knowledge, it seems to me. And then you run through some of the others, like experience, reason, intuition, memory, some of the other sources of belief, and you're already moving into, faithcraft, with respect to those as well. So as we come as epistemic agents, so all of the conversation that we have running up to that question, and the readings that we have, either implicitly or explicitly, they're raising that before us. I would argue even Descartes, although he is that great term to the S, and for that reason we can sort of throw eggs or whatever. But even Descartes, operates with respect to a kind of faithfulness. His skepticism is only a very light skepticism. He still thinks he's walking around not dreaming all the time, that sort of thing. Although sometimes students wonder, and I like to play on that. That's true, just for fun, for kicks. That be-like industry is the primary sources, in part, right? So you have this set of these great texts through history, and so our task as the bees in the classroom is to sort of go to each one of those flowers, each one individually, and bring that back to the hive, So each one reading, you talked about readings, there's a great quote in there about reading, I just love it, I'm going to use it. Where did I can't remember it anyway, but in your article. So you go, everyone reads, comes back, and sees something different, right? And it's only in that collective engagement, that conversation that happens in that classroom, where we can sort of approximate the truth. We can sort of come to it together. And, my reading of the philosophers has changed over the time in my gen ed courses, for sure. There's no question. Just the questions that they raise with respect to the text, or the text raises for them, and the way that they're answered. Anyway, I think that be-like image is genius. And then just quickly, that goes to the groupthink. I guess I want to quibble a little bit. With Aristotle, he thought that rational animals, when collected together, would reason well together. and hopefully we end up being called rational animals. That's the question, right? So he's got a little rational, or understanding rationality sort of operating in the background that's not as generous as you and I might like to make it. Nevertheless, that sort of groupthink, as I said before, is the means by which we come to the truth. Not that, it seems to me. And so we talk about it. The point is, this is, how do you talk about this in GE classes? We talk about this in GE classes. And it's not that truth changes, but how we practice truth changes as a group, as a people. I think that's right. And then the honey, yeah. We don't have, skepticism is a kind of luxury, right? We still make it home reliably, we still engage in relationship reliably, we still work out our lives together reliably. So it's, to me at least, that honey piece, we still get it right. Even Descartes would say we still get it right most of the time. And when we are working together with all voices heard and at the table, it seems to me, and when we model that in the classroom, right, in terms of the engagement with students, it seems to me that sort of is revealed.
I just have two things to respond. One is this is why I like working in, no, I've got actually a microphone they gave me. This is why I like working at a Christian college. I fully don't want to come off as like I'm telling people you're doing things wrong, because I actually think that, Rob, you and I know each other. I mean, I think you're doing great, and Heather and the other philosophers. I mean, this is the kind of thing we are distinctively Christian, where we can model to the rest of the world a better way of doing things. Because, frankly, I came out of UCSB and the state school system and was tenured in the state system. And the thing is you have a much harsher environment, a radical critical thinking, where question authorities on the bumper stickers when I was a kid, and this idea. Whereas we're definitely not that. And I think that's what makes it really so, that's what's distinctive and wonderful, and actually where we have something to offer. So yes, good. On the other hand is I would like to say also that where I think we can judge a little, if you wanted a little test case, a little something, is do I ever mention obedience? Do I ever mention mental obedience to my students? Like I try and do this regularly in my classes. We obey. We fit ourselves in. We submit to this that comes down to us because we have no other recourse. Or you can not submit only if you've got some sort of real different way to do it. You do this for citizenship and all that sort of stuff. This is where Quintilian and Plutarch and these other people talked about philosophy being very distinctive, because Quintilian, first page, says, I think it's the first page, he says, I'm here to teach citizenship, not philosophy. I'm teaching students how to be citizens, not philosophers. And that's the distinction. It's sort of an old distinction. Because I certainly don't want, I think you guys here are doing a great job.
Okay. When I read your article, I wrote you, I hate these, I wrote you an email back that I found the arguments, especially number one, to be very provocative and generative for me. In that, as a scientist, and what you said, that hero with a big S on my shirt, I mean, those are my people. And so one of the first, and the article is filled with questions about what to do with the article. Do I interpret it from the perspective and view of a Christian? Do I interpret it from the perspective view of a scientist? And I am both a Christian and a scientist, so it brings up different questions based on what hat I want to put on at the moment. But who's my society? So I think about most knowledge is social and requires social methods. My community is the scientists that are trying to find and question and push the envelope and create a paradigm shift. And this is how we are raised. This is the agenda set before us. Alternately, we are also trusting and have faith in all of the people that came before us, that they actually did these experiments and the notes that they took were true and that they actually have these findings. But the nature of science itself is that other people repeat the experiments. There's a bunch of science people in here, which is good. That is the nature of science, that these things are repeated and confirmed. And so you have to have less faith in that instance because of the nature of that field. So what do I do with that in a classroom where my objective is to teach students to be scientists with this particular perspective about analyzing and criticizing and what are the underlying assumptions, and right? And then also from the faith perspective, which then blends in with the complicated topics. You hit evolution, you hit global climate change, these kinds of things. You sort of hit a wall here because the science community is in agreement and the faith community is not in agreement. And what do you do about that? And who is, if you're teaching faithcraft, who is the community of the students? Who is the social world that they're supposed to be aligning, right? And it's why it's very provocative and generative for me, because I don't know what to do with that. Last but not least, with respect to specifically GE courses, and I'm going to give 100% credit to Joe for this, because Joe showed me a link that I hadn't seen. So I do something called team-based learning light. I do team-based learning light from Ken. And these four align beautifully with what we're trying to do with team-based learning. And I do that in my GE class, I do it in my regular classes. There is knowledge. We are taking some of this information, existing graphs, existing data. We're sitting, we're pouring through it, we're making sense of it, we're gathering it, we're adding more information to it. We're making sense of it. We're submitting to authority of what the group is saying, the consensus among the group of what we're going to do with this, presenting our idea to the rest of the class. And then, in the end, honey, these kids leave with a rich, deep understanding, not only of content, but of the process of science in doing this. So really, it's a beautiful way to connect to these things without all the problematic stuff I brought up.
No, that's great. That's, April, great.
Kendra, anything to add?
Kind of out of my league here, and lots of big words getting thrown around. I read this and the question that kept coming to my mind was, what is the environment of the hive? And I think this presupposes that people feel comfortable, right, coming to a place where their voice is heard and their role is heard, and how do we do that, and how do we best facilitate that practice? And do they come, or do they go to a different hive, or how is that taken into account? And so I was thinking about GE. So in the psych department, we do Psych 101, right? And we kind of get a bad rap in psychology. Like personal happiness, as long as you're good and it feels good. But a lot of what I perceive as taking place in that class is really preparing students, one, in the sections to understand some of their unique voices and their roles and what they bring and what they contribute. And then the beauty of that course, in my mind, is also then having the beginning of these conversations in these small groups, where they are, again, learning, in my mind, to come to the table with other people, and what does it mean to be a community, and I supervise leaders for that, and so one of my leaders this week said, we talked about what does it mean to be selfless, and can you be selfless? And they all went and ran with that. But I think that requires an environment and a teaching of skills and a way, particularly for me as a professor, to create that environment where people feel comfortable and have a sense of affirmation of their uniqueness and their place at the table. So, kind of a different.
Yeah. So playing off that environment thing a little bit, we can all imagine classes that we've been in that haven't been, we haven't felt like we're really able to contribute. We haven't been invited to contribute. In fact, if we offer to contribute, we might shut down. And we would be a little bit of an annoyance if we're kind of interrupting what's going on, right? So, to me, what this links into is pedagogy. How do you infuse this into your pedagogy? And what does your pedagogy say about whether or not you are inviting students into this humble thinking and faith craft along the way? And so I guess that kind of leads into the next question of how do we model this for our students in the classroom through the pedagogy that we use, or do we model this? Do we tell them that they are invited to participate in, and we are trying to help them connect in to the whole thing, and in the end, honey? Or do we give them the message that I've got the answers, you just need to sit there and assimilate it all together and tell me what I told you. So how do we model that? How have you found ways in your own teaching, in your own pedagogy, to model that for students? Or how have you seen a colleague do that especially well? What does that look like?
One of the things that I think really helps students is if we can be explicit or be articulate at a metacognitive level what we're doing. So for example, if I'm talking to my students about how I connect science with faith, how I connect my Christian faith with evolution, I can talk to them about why it is that I have the faith I have. And I'm believing the people that saw Jesus after his death. I'm trusting in that written stuff. I'm also trusting in the studies that were done in the last couple 100 years in my field. And I'm making a choice to not make one, it's not the language I want to use, but higher or more important than the other one. In other words, I see a lot of secular scientists say, well, if you can't prove God, then there's no God, and blah, blah, blah. This is kind of the avenue they want to take. That these are not the same kind of questions, but my faith, my Christian faith, has a lot of faith in the people that come before me. And my science has a lot of faith in the people that have come before me and the scientists that have come before me. And just to make that explicit, to be a little vulnerable, I think being vulnerable is really going to help this a lot. You don't know all the answers, and it isn't too far before you're going to ask me a theology question, or I'm going to hit my limit of, I don't know, gotta go ask that one to Lodal or somebody, because I don't know. And just not knowing it all and not having all the answers can definitely provide space for the person to not, the student, to wrestle and not have all the answers. We don't give them that space. I know everything, you need to know everything I know, perform. And that kind of leaves them, there is no room to be human.
So in some ways, the pedagogy of not giving the illusion that you know everything as the instructor, or having to know everything as the instructor, even if you do know some things, maybe even reining that back in order to invite them in might be a way in which to model this in the classroom. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Yeah, let me, in history, it's very easy because I'm teaching ancient history and we just don't know much. And we have to trust our sources. And so it's a very normal sort of thing for us who teach history and especially any time before modern history, just keeping our students appraised of how little we know. Because how little we know helps us understand that we've got to make decisions with what we do know, you know, and things like that. And so this negotiation of with people in the past and us today is very much a part of what we teach, I think, as historians. And it's so it's easier. I think it's easier in history to do the kind of humble think and faithcraft that I talked about. And it's also just, you know, within Christian tradition, like when you have, there's a famous line from G.K. Chesterton about how orthodoxy means giving a vote to dead people about what you think, okay? Well, we do that a lot in history. We do that regularly through everything. It's like dead people, long dead people, if there's thousands of dead people they get a vote in how I think about these things, because not only is it just a matter of source material, I'm gonna submit to the standards that have been set throughout time as orthodoxy or something like that in different areas, Christian and other areas too. We do this politically, we do this in the judicial system. So to actively talk about us submitting, actively talk about us feeling obligated to our sources. I teach Herodotus to my World Civ, ancient histories, and they you know, it's fun to teach Herodotus because Herodotus is constantly talking about how, oh, I'm obligated to give you this information because a bunch of people have said it, but frankly, I don't believe it. You know, things like that. You know, and it's just it destabilizes you in a way that we're all in this together. You know, this is the best we got. So let's go. So I do think, though, it's important to we are all weak, and we are all submitting to various types of traditions as we go into this. April's bringing up the science. We are in our disciplinary traditions, we're in our church traditions, we're in certain other traditions, and so we negotiate between these traditions. McIntyre is the great author on this subject.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
I guess I want to second a lot of what April said in terms of vulnerability. And I think in GE courses, and I also do a lot of service learning courses, so I actually teach more non-psych people than psych people. But I think things as simple as, again, that saying I don't have all the answers, of just saying, somebody asks a question and I don't know, I'm like, who does know? Right? Something as simple as saying, what do you have to add? And they do. I think is an incredibly powerful piece. And just again, talking to them about, I love having all these different people in here because none of us, you know, we all come to the table with different information. So just making that explicit. And then I think too, modeling some of that vulnerability in terms of being willing to come back after a class session and say, that did not go as I planned. And after I left, I was aware that this could have been taken these different ways, and this was the feeling I got. Is that accurate? And let's try that again. And modeling, in my opinion, you know me, I talk about tear and repair all the time, but modeling that engagement, that I might have gotten this wrong. Did I get this wrong? Okay, how do we now move on from here? And again, making that very explicit to students.
That piece, the pedagogy element, is particular, at least from my perspective, places me in a greater position of vulnerability because this is my trade, this is my craft. But absolutely, have I flopped in the classroom? So many times. Sorry, You've already given me tenure, so it's just, should have let you know that earlier. But it is, it's coming back and just saying, whoa, we tried something, didn't work, let's try something else. The other thing is, so I really like that. We don't have all the answers in our content area, so-called, or in teaching, I don't have all of the answers. I also try to decentralize as much as I can, and so try to get students in the position of facilitation and presentation, and et cetera, even in gen ed classes. So a first-year student was up teaching intro to philosophy on the theory of knowledge, stuff that I didn't know, right? I just didn't know the stuff that she had to bring to the table, so she got up and then we went back and forth, and that's awesome, So those sorts of moments are fantastic, and if you can build it into the syllabus more, the better.
I think the one danger that came up for me when I was reading this, and I thought about your number 3, and submitting to authority. So whenever I see the submitting word, I always pause and regroup. And I think that can be taken wrong. You don't mean for it to be, but I think it can be taken in a classroom situation as I'm the authority, submit. So, for example, one could teach evolution in such a way as this is what the science says, and if you don't agree with this, and you don't agree with the mainstream science, and these are the authorities in our field, then you aren't really a biologist. And I say that and you think, who would ever say that? Well, I know somebody would say that because I interviewed them during my sabbatical last fall at another university. That's a Christian university that we respect. And that was exactly his position. He said, I can't respect any student that leaves my class that hasn't accepted evolution. I can't accept them as a biologist anymore, and I have no respect for them because they don't respect the biology and the history and the nature of biology, da-da-da. So I think it could go way wrong. We should be aware of that.
Yeah, and in some ways, humility, when you're talking about knowledge, knowledge can be kind of a head trip. It can really lead to an ego. We've all seen them in our discipline, right? And the idea of being the person who is in front leading, there's a power that's there. And sometimes it may be difficult to kind of back down from that to allow people an opportunity to engage. Whereas it's more comfortable for me to be in control of the whole thing. I have found that in opening it up, I lose a lot of control. And it's a lot harder for me to even pull it all together in some ways. But it's also more rich. And people take things away from it and hold it. So one last question, then we'll open it up to the audience. Where is there opportunity for departments to talk about things like this? Or do departments talk about things like this? If this is something that is unique to our tradition, or if this is something that should be embedded within our tradition, where do we talk about that? Or maybe put another way, how should what we do here be different than where you were at UCSB or at Redlands? Should that be evident to a student in our class that they're not at Redlands, but they're at one of the next years? I think.
Well, I definitely think that there should be. I think that this is one of the beautiful things about the Christian tradition is its affirmation of this Aristotelian tradition and how it quickly merged at the very beginnings of Christian education in the first 100 years of how it's like what Paul says. Paul says we submit to each other. Paul says we imitate Christ in Christ humbling himself. That this isn't a great triumphal path. So in a Christian education, I mean, to me, it's so different from secular education. Secular education is this triumph, and I'm teaching you liberal arts so that you can have power, you can have prestige, and all of the goals, everything's out of whack. I mean, I think we all agree on this. This is what's so beautiful about a Christian college, and we have to work consciously, intentionally to make that distinction. That even when we submit to the disciplinary traditions we have and stuff like that, we do so very consciously explaining, and working with our students and helping other people understand that we are ultimately in a type of submitting position. We are in a obedience position. I am not simply some sort of superhero critical thinker who's got free thought and tenure gave me like a license for, like I'm like 007 or something out there, but that's the thing is we are all under obligation all the time. And because Jesus put himself under obligation, and then we put ourselves under obligation too. So yeah, Christianity to me is like topsy-turvy of what the Christian education is topsy-turvy to what secular education is about, even though we share the same roots, deep roots.
Other thoughts?
Wouldn't you say that part of the argument you're giving in the paper is a call to the Christian liberal arts to engage in humble think, the teaching, of modeling of the fostering an environment of humble think, but also to the larger or the secular or you're calling them to return to their classical roots, aren't you?
I don't think they read this journal. Dang it! I don't think it's even like a JSTOR or anything. So I don't know. Oh well.
Other thoughts? Questions from the audience? Mark. Go ahead. Go.
Mark with a C is before Mark with a K.
Absolutely. I have a couple questions or thoughts that I just want to get. So I'm thinking of my GE course, Chemical Society. And I think actually a lot of the difficulty between what you're kind of calling the science aspect versus these traditional roots is a confusion of facts and truth. That facts and truth aren't really the same thing. And I might teach my GE class, I'm thinking about, you guys are causing me to think about this sitting here, very differently if I want the truth in my class to be taught, that science, that chemistry is an important part of today's life. That's a truth that I want to bring to the table, of which these facts that we're going to talk about develop along the way and look at the patterns of how these facts were unfolded and everything, how they speak into that truth, right? And so could you just maybe talk a little bit about how maybe truth versus facts play and the semantics that are playing into this?
I'm glad you're working it through in a chemistry class. I don't really feel competent to even talk about it and how you in the terms you're using, and it is, my hope that this just if we talk about it and think about it, those are the issues that'll keep coming up. But no, I really don't have any idea of, because to me, when I think of science, okay, as an outsider who, took chemistry, I don't think ever. I don't think I ever, it was a darn 70s education. The thing of, is that my impression of chemistry is that it's a very sort of gung-ho, we can build it sort of discipline. And there's a sort of spirit of gung-ho building aspects of put the Lincoln Logs together and make it all happen, And so there's a sort of temperament of triumphalism and power that is promoted in it, which I would want, I guess, that there would be a mitigation of that. There'd be somehow a balance to that be taught. And the balance to me is the fact that most people don't redo experiments. Most people just read about an experiment and then build upon it. So there's a type of pyramid effect that happens, but...
Somebody does eventually, and you're retracted, and that's really embarrassing if that happens. But the reality is, see, I still focus on a difference. chemists are seeking facts at the end of the day, right? I think it's easy to talk about that as a truth, which is, it's a bit, I think it can be used very differently. I mean, we're trying to describe a scenario that will occur this specific way every time anybody looks at it. We call that knowledge, fact, it's done, right? And so those really are open to everybody's feeling and interpretation about it, whether they're happy that that happens that way or not, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's factual. Now, how, there's many ethical questions or whatever else that you could pour out of what you do with that factual knowledge, right? That I would consider maybe truths or, social ideas. But the question is, again, I'm thinking of it myself, when I'm sitting down to teach my community society class, what is the end goal that I'm trying to do? And I think of it up till this point as just trying to get them some chemical literacy skills, right? To be able to read chemistry a little bit, right? To understand something that we're going to read in the New York Times or Time Magazine or whatever in the future. Maybe that's falling short. Right?
And maybe we need to think larger here, which is the great truth, is that I in the history class, I'm like pushing some one thing, which is this sort of, whereas then the chemistry, my nursing students take my class, then they take your class, they all take all of our classes, and we ultimately can balance each other. Because frankly, chemistry is probably the one area that I'm thinking doesn't fit as well as like other disciplines. I mean, you amaze me.
Mark is good. Mark?
Yeah, so Rick, first of all, congratulations on the award. You do point Loma well. Secondly, I find myself very attracted to this metaphor of the beehive, and I think it's a beautiful analogy for what education can be, and I love the idea of the kind of the hive transforming pollen into honey. I think it's just kind of this beautiful, almost romantic, but it's a beautiful image of, I guess, the work that we hope the Holy Spirit engages us in whatever disciplines we're in. What I'm wondering is, and this goes back to actually thinking about my own gen ed teaching, is my work in Christian tradition, right, which I just taught in this class right before this session, and I think about the students that I have who come in and they've just grown up in the Rock, right? A church like the Rock, this non-denominational evangelical church, and they think that like the Christian tradition is what I've experienced. And one of the things that I require them, in class, I try to help them see the kind of breadth and complexity of the Christian tradition, and appreciate the kind of breadth of it. And sometimes that means like introducing them to some of the heretical movements within Christianity, and even seeing like here's the reason why Arians believed what they did, right? Or the Gnostics believed what they did, even though I have my own criticisms and affirm that. So guess what I'm getting to is I have a deep sense of sympathy with this idea of in a kind of McIntyrean way, helping students to first of all think from within a tradition, but it seems to me, I guess where I have my questions or my concerns is that suddenly turns into complete submission to consensus and authority and kind of a swarm think, right? And part of me asks, where's the place of Aristotelian thought in Christianity, right? Which is kind of lost after the first century as is Stoicism, with the kind of overwhelming acceptance of Platonism, and doesn't reemerge until like the 1100s with Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, right? In a way, if they give in completely to consensus and authority and swarm think, we're not even talking about Aristotle as a Christian university, right? Where's the place for a Galileo or a Copernicus or a Kepler, right? Who's going against the swarm think, right? And again, I'm sympathetic with this, like, I was thinking the scholar with the big N on his chest, right, where it's all about novelty, coming up with ideas what it's about, or even individuality. And this is where I'm especially sympathetic with you, because I think we fall into the trap of indoctrinating our students to think of themselves, and this is where I feel our most powerful message here. We indoctrinate our students into thinking that ultimately they're all individual critical thinkers, that for which like theology and truth and all these things they're the individual arbitrators of what truth is. right? Rather than learning to first think within a tradition. So I guess that's the question I'm asking, right? Where does the individual and what the individual has to
You
offer?
articulate the question well, and I don't know the answer.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it is the great problem, right? I mean, it can't be all or it's one or the other. It has to be some sort of whole.
In some ways, you did articulate it in that you said, unless there's some great bit of information that changes things. You know, you've got to have a really good reason to do that.
And in most situations, I think it's true within, Galileo.
Yeah. Okay, so
Thomas Aquinas.
I got Diana, and then Michael, and then Ken, and then Carl. You still up? And then Carl, and then Bettina. It's the order I've seen those hands. And then so.
Well, actually, my response is rather limited to the discussion you had, and I'm just
I
reminded
think
of.
people are hearing you, Diane.
No, we couldn't hear you.
Right. Okay, I was just thinking of this discussion between Mark here and Rick, and this conflict between fact and truth, and I'm just reminded of Nietzsche's famous saying that philosophy teaches us the limits of science, and that the true goal of philosophy is to teach us to value science as a producer of facts. That we do produce facts, but we take it down a notch maybe from the scientific positivistic triumphalism of our day and make it submit to the end game of philosophy, which is the search for truth, and that the two functions are separate, and that the scientist can, I think, learn from this, I think from Nietzsche's great critique of scientism and science ideology that he formed in the late 19th century. Beyond that, I have no comments, except I suppose that the amass of facts would eventually create a paradigm shift, that would, create new truths. But,
Just look at the history of chemistry. Just take that seriously in the
Cosmology.
So I think the context of this is even more important and interesting in relation to a Christian university, but I think it's there for anything. And when I look at this, I see the scientific method, and let me explain a little bit. And the great thing about the scientific method is it's not just for science, it's a way of thinking of things. And the first part of the scientific method is observation. And what we need to teach our students is observation is always in the context of experience, what you already know and things like that. And that observation then leads to explanation. You go and gather facts, you go and gather what's already known, and to learn about what the next relevant questions are. The one caveat I would say to that is here's where a little bit of skepticism comes in, because you need to be experimentation then. But if we jump on to 3, the way science works is the cream rises to the top because it's repeated over and over again, and you basically have this swarm thing where if enough people have repeated and kind of the facts have come to the surface, then it's there, and anything that was misinterpreted or whatever kind of falls along the wayside as you go. And in doing this, you get some great innovations in science and so forth. The caveat there in the skepticism, the experimentation, I think what we need to realize is that that's not necessarily meaning skepticism of everything that's already known and presented to you. That's skepticism of yourself. What I teach my students is that I'm in the business of proving myself wrong, and sadly business is good. I prove myself wrong all the time. But basically you're experimenting to try and figure out a way that there might be a new explanation or a new interpretation of what I'm giving. And that's true in experimental science, that's true in what your beliefs are. So if you can be humble and realize that there might be another way of looking at something, then you can add that into this, and that really is the scientific method, whether it's applied to science or to anything else.
You describe it very well, and you're absolutely right. The one big distinction, going back to the foundations of this tradition, is the distinction between observation, which can be done by yourself, versus what we're talking about here with Faithcraft, is information you can't know unless you trust someone else. So there's a little bit of a starting point difference there, but you describe it very well, and I think it fits, it does fit well.
And I would say that Michael's humbleness as a scientist is not exhibited by all scientists. Do we need to say more?
scientific method to the students at the beginning of class, I always bound it by saying there are certain areas where science has no rationale, no reason to be speaking. And that's where humility comes in for the scientists, is we have a certain domain of knowledge that we can pursue, but that domain is limited. And I think an honest scientist, a thoughtful scientist, is going to have to admit to that early on in their talk. I'm curious, though, about this idea of submission, because I know you would probably argue, Rick, that historically individuals, I mean, we complain about American individualism and how, the authority of the church has almost completely disappeared. Although that was a very important position for most of Orthodox Christianity. And maybe some of that's been traded for the authority of the science or the scientific method, not just physical sciences or biological sciences, but all of even social sciences. And so it's an interesting combination of submitting to some authority, and I think we all probably have to do that to some degree to move forward, with the faithcraft ideas, but have we traded off one submission for another, and if so, is that a good or a bad thing? But there is that authority out there.
Yeah.
And we rail against it. We don't like to submit to authority.
Yeah. I should make a very strong position here that on this subject, I would be like a AA minor league player. You read McIntyre, you read the big thinkers on it. Who's justice, who's rationality? There's a great book by McIntyre. He gets into these things exactly, like the Islamic tradition and the Christian tradition, and I mean the big issues. I mean, we're doing little things here, and it is the human issue. It's the human problem. But if anything, it's that we cannot hold up the individual critical thinker so much to the detriment of we're group thinkers, we're swarm think, and we need to recognize when that's appropriate.
And to go into pedagogy of that for just a moment, I mean, that then brings you back to the question of what do we do in a classroom? I mean, if we do completely groupthink, like, okay, let's rediscover, the gas laws of science. I mean,
sounds so fun.
What's the point of that? I mean, why waste the time doing things that everyone has reached consensus on and we're willing to submit to?
It's what we do in history classes every day.
Yeah, so I mean, there's some degree in which authority.
Napoleon always loses.
Authority needs to speak. I mean, we need to have some authority to speak, right? In some ways, you say, well, your students start going off saying the aliens designed the pyramids of Egypt. You're not going to let that go very far without.
It's fun though. He's thought about
I'll
Rick,
submit to my
Rick, the fact that your piece came out in the fall issue, I was just reminded of this, may contribute to why, as I was reading it when it first came out, my reaction throughout the whole thing was, yes, but, because in the fall I teach American Writers 1, and I'm just up to my neck in American romantics. And Emerson, especially, with whom I'm having just a war for since the early 80s. And Thoreau, who says, why doesn't society appreciate its wise minority? And so this was the whole issue, and yet, let me back up here. So my question is this question of, what about when the majority is not being rational, but is being irrational, and in fact is silencing voices, women's voices, in the American tradition, women's voices, black voices, and so to me it's to try to balance that, Native American voices, Asian American voices, the list goes on. So it comes back to how do you kind of honor that without going in the direction of Emerson, who basically says there is no authority above my own intuition. That the trait of authority is not from the church to science as much as it is from all of that to myself. And if it doesn't make sense to me, if it does not resonate with what is deepest in me, then I have no responsibility to accept it. And I think that's the tradition that we're working against. And so I think that part of the thing in a science classroom is that we live in a society where both evangelical Christians and a lot of other folks in our society do not accept the authority of
I mean, you have
science.
vaccines, you have global climate change, you have stuff that's funky.
So here's what is interesting to me, Rick. So first of all, this is to me the unanswerable thing. It's like, how do you account for people like Frederick Douglass, people like Henry David Thoreau, and the other thing that is, it's more interesting to me, the people like Angelina Grimke and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who read one tradition against another. That to me is what's really interesting. It's like, okay, so here is one tradition that is telling me that I should submit, but there's this other tradition. And that, I find those thinkers much more compelling, frankly, than Emerson, who says simply, it doesn't seem right to me.
Who's the most compelling traditional thinker in American history but Martin Luther King, right? How he wants change is because we got to look backward and see where we came from. We look at Frederick Douglass, look at that Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
And so you take the tradition and you move on. This is the essay concerning development of Christian doctrine by John Henry Newman. But he has these 7, which were rules for genuine development. This was a profoundly conservative, and I'm a believer that conservatism is probably what we're supposed to do at the university most. But we conserve, we nurture, we steward knowledge and traditions. But we want it to change, we want it to develop, we want it to get better. So these are the rules for development that John Henry Newman gave, which are very good, and I think they work also for science and other things like that. Especially logical sequence, preservation of type, anticipation of future. This one here, like in a Lactosian way, that the scientists like, this is like, does it anticipate new discoveries? Can it be accommodate new discoveries and things like that? So very useful. I have no, I looked at my man here. How to make change happen. If I understand that's what you're talking about.
But I think one of the really interesting things about your article is that it does challenge this profoundly deep American romanticism, which has had tremendous influence in American Christianity as well, which basically says there is no authority above the individual conscience. And I'm under no obligation to answer to any authority. And that is something that, to try to counter that in the humanities classroom, at least in an American context, is really a great challenge. Because it is so deeply embedded in the American experience.
This is one of the interesting things about studying American evangelicalism. Evangelicalism has this deep, deep submissive commitment to the Bible, at the same time believing this American exceptionalism and we're wonderful. And how do you get this thing to work? And it's a very dynamic, fun thing that just goes through this.
Well, I would say that the commitment to the Bible is oftentimes the commitment to my interpretation of the Bible. My lone interpretation that I consider.
Well, let's not overstate it.
I think it's oftentimes my individual interpretation of it.
First of all, Rick, I want to just say, great job. It's not easy to stand up in a room full of PhDs or DMAs or whatever all we are and do your studies. So, great job. And thank you, Carrie, for letting us have some time for a conversation like this. I have 2 really simple questions that kept popping up in my mind, and they, in some ways, follow from what Carl said, but in some ways they are the meta-cognitive step before what he said. And the 2 simple questions are, and I can't remember because I read my basic philosophy as an undergrad, but I think it was Kierkegaard. Could have been Kant, but I think it was Kierkegaard. They are, I know that. I think it was Kierkegaard who said the crowd is untruth. So I kept thinking about that as I was listening to we all come together, we swarm think, we submit to the authorities that have gone before. So there's a tension there in my mind between And in rhetoric and composition studies, the way I have learned and the way I teach this in writing, when you're doing research, you are reporting reports of evidence. Because rarely can you go directly back to the evidence yourself. So there's an element of faith there. I understand what your argument is. The other question I kept thinking about is, you kept saying the people, and Carl kept saying the individual, the individual. And I keep wondering, who are the people? What individual are we talking about? Because as I listen to you, and of course you would expect me to say this, it's the white male people. It's the white male individual. How many women was Aristotle referring to? When we think of the individual or the romantic person with the S on the chest, thanks for the visual, April, but I don't think it's a woman we really think of when we think of that image. So at the very beginning, before we even get out of the gate, I'm thinking, who are the people? Who is the individual? And how do I deal with this tension of living my entire intellectual life, my entire faith life, my entire professional life, as a person who's not been in the center? It wasn't women who wrote the creeds of the church. It wasn't women who established the canons of the church or literature or history or science. And I do have to say, I'm not a chemist, but I did take chemistry and I learned my periodic table. And one of the wondrous things I remember from chemistry is that the way the molecules go together in chemistry to produce salt is in a perfect cube. And if you look at salt in your hand, every single one of those little grains of salt is a perfect cube. That for me is fact and wonder in one piece. I don't know if there's a question.
By the way, let me just say one thing. One of the great things about the changes with women, slavery, all these major issues in the world today isn't that they are ancient. If you go back to these ancient sources, go to Aristotle, go to the Bible, go to Herodotus. I was teaching today. Ancient women, ancient slavery, these are the big issues then. What happened in a big picture is that a lot of things got solidified in the late 18th century and 19th century. They had to be broken down in the 20th century. Yes, but they were broken down in the 20th century by going back to our sources. Finding that like I taught today, the whole Persian Empire in Herodotus hangs on a shepherd woman. You know, stories like that Herodotus tells, 450 BC. These are stories that got forgotten in the 1890s. You know, part of this romantic scientism that we got into became very, very male in the 1890s through especially right after World War II. But going back to the 1970s are not brand new. The women's movement, the slaves, the Cesar Chavez, it's going back to great deep traditions beyond them. And so I agree with you in a lot of ways, but I don't want to create a world in which suddenly we today, since 1970, are somehow the Enlightened. They're deep, deep traditions.
I agree, and I resonate with what you're saying there too. I guess one of the overarching difficulties I have with all of our conversation today is I don't think we've been very tidy with our definitions or our terms. We talk about individualism and we're sort of saying we want to get away from this idolatry of the individual, but then we're slipping into pedagogy saying, oh, but you know, all voices are equal and an 18-year-old has as much to bring to the table as someone who has done 1,000 science experiments and who has studied this and who has experience in the linguistic reservoir, or whatever you want to call it, that gives them a little bit more to bring to the table. So there are tensions here that we've been very sloppy with, I think.
I also want to echo my two colleagues, and I don't want to pile on about this, but I do think sort of calling attention to positions of privilege that have dominated the traditions that have, by definition, dominated is a wise thing to do and fits really nicely, in fact, with your thesis regarding humility. And so to recognize some of the limitations of that tradition by making use of that tradition at the same time. Part of what it means to look back at a tradition, which can be traceable back to Aristotle, for example. Part of what it means for me as a philosophy professor to highlight Aristotle, to spend a great deal of time in my general education classes with Aristotle, is to point out some of the paradox that happens with me as an expert on Aristotle, making clear the fact, drawing attention to the fact, in fact, that I am a woman teaching Aristotle. Aristotle, who is quite clear on the notion of a woman as derivative monstrosity. Something has gone horribly wrong if a woman exists, much less to speak of her incapacity to enter the public sphere, much less become the revered philosopher. And so there is a complexity that comes with engaging that tradition. So never making the argument that we should ignore it, or I can't wait to move on from that tradition. But that tradition is made more rich as we engage it from our positions within the present. So the fact that I am a woman philosopher teaching Aristotle, who believes that this is an impossibility, is a way of critiquing that tradition while spending time with it. And teaching a lesson along with that. So.
Just one thing is that you and I know quite well that Aristotle speaks differently in different books at different levels of certainty, and he pokes at a lot of things and disagrees with himself a lot of things over a lot of things. Sure. So I don't know specifically the passage you're talking about, but like in the politics,
I do. I can help you out.
Politics he handles women completely differently. So the thing is there's some fuzzy stuff here, and we admit that. I would just hate for you all to walk away thinking that Aristotle actually believes that as if it's written in stone.
Just one quick point. The metaphor of the hive is perfect here, right? Because who runs the hive? The queen bee, and it's all female bees doing the work, and it's the drones that are just kind of these dumb things bouncing around in there. They don't know what they're there for. So I think there we go.
I don't like this metaphor as much.
Last question, Rebecca.
I don't know how much of a question versus just commenting and bringing things together. Just reflecting on how a lot of revolutions really are going back to older traditions. I mean, Martin Luther King was brought up, but I also was thinking Martin Luther, when he transformed the church, was actually pulling it back towards older traditions. And for myself in the sciences, I'm in the neurosciences. As I studied neuroscience, my understanding of what it meant to be a human being changed. And I was later pleasantly surprised to realize as I was changing that concept, I was finding different Christian traditions that I now feel are more closely aligned to theological truths than what I had before. And I also have found that with my understanding now of evolution and so forth. And so sometimes traditions do butt against each other, but for me, and hopefully my students get this a little bit, sometimes these traditions actually drive us deeper into each other. And I don't know what the question is.
Well, I know there's more that we can talk about, and I'm sure I'm willing to say afterwards, but I was also told that we have to end on time, and so we are going to end on time. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to come participate in this. I want to thank Rick for writing the article.